Ivan, welcome to Copenhagen. A political scientist from Bulgaria. That sounds like schnapps from Macedonia. People of Western Europe are not that concerned about Eastern Europe. And the ordinary West German is not that interested in Eastern Germany. A foreign world which is costing the West German taxpayer far too much money and which shows far too little gratitude and votes for too many populists. These, as I'm sure you've guessed, are not my own words, but the beginning of a very long interview with you, Ivan, in the German weekly Der Spiegel, which came out a couple of weeks ago, obviously based on your book. And the point that the Spiegel was trying to make is obviously that many of us in Western Europe are not that well acquainted with Eastern Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe, as we should rightly call it. Or to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain, it's a mid-sized region of which we know little. And there is definitely a wall, you could say, often of prejudices, although we are now in this week marking the incredible event of the very fact that the Berlin Wall has now been gone longer than it's actually been dividing Germany and Europe. There are many exceptions to this, particularly in this audience. Many people really follow also Central and Eastern Europe. But still, if you look upon the debate at the moment, there are many things that are puzzling us. For instance, why are so many Central European citizens that worried about refugees, if you look upon the number of refugees? How did the separation of powers suddenly sort of lose its appeal in the region? Another question. And then also, when one studies the various opinion polls, you also mention a couple in your book, well, you end up thinking, we do not really agree. I mean, where's the threat in Europe these days? Because if you look upon opinion polls, I remember reading one, Bulgarians, if there's a major crisis in Europe, Bulgarians will apparently turn towards the Russians and not towards NATO and the United States of America. These are just some of the questions that we'll try to cover in this conversation. There are many more. And I'm sure that there's no one who's better in trying to educate us on the region, but particularly also the interconnections between East and Western Europe. I brought a number of books here that I'll use while interviewing, books that you have referred to in your own book. And you've already been introduced, but when I was sort of reading up on you, I thought it was also interesting to say you were born in '65 in Bulgaria. Your father was a member of the Communist Party, and he was editor-in-chief of a communist newspaper. Yep. You studied during the Glasnost days in Bulgaria, and you were in your final year at the Sofia University in '89. Absolutely. So an 89er here we have among us, when the world turned upside down, and as a Russian songwriter has tellingly put it, it had never occurred to me that in the Soviet Union anything could ever change, let alone that it could disappear. But it did, and that obviously also opened many new opportunities for you. You went to Oxford, you set up a think tank, and now you are in Vienna. You're also a member of a number of think tanks, for instance, European Council on Foreign Relations, where we occasionally meet. But then, to start off, when one reads your book and one just looks upon the front page, I must admit I was quite puzzled about the title, After Europe. So, is this the end with Europe? What's coming afterwards? And then I thought, then I saw what the German title was. There it's called Europadämmerung. And that, in my mind, is something about where it gets dark, but then it can actually, then the sun can rise again. So what's the point with the title?
Listen, this is good about titles. Authors never put the titles. Titles about publishers.
Yeah.
But my title was commercially so stupid that I should be very grateful to the publisher. The original title under which I was writing was called Perhapsburg. This is when you send Bulgarian to Vienna, this is what's going to happen. I want, first of all, very much to say how grateful I am for the translation and for this opportunity, because talking about Oxford when I was there in 1992, I remember complaining to an old German professor, saying, listen, for the last 20 years, there was more than 40 dissertations being defended on Poland, and there was not a single one on Bulgaria. And he looked at me and said, But boy, Poland is a career, Bulgaria is just a hobby. From this point of view, basically having the opportunity to talk and to do is, and listen, from certain point of view, I do believe that European Union as we knew it is not there anymore. It's not a bad news, to be honest. There is no, the book, because of the title, was read is slightly more pessimistic than it is. I do believe it's an open-end story. But there is one important difference between East and West when we're looking at the crisis, and this is why it was so important for me to bring this story. Listen, for all of us, nevertheless, where politically stand, we saw a major political system basically collapsing in front of our eyes. In the late 1980s, and Bulgaria was not Poland, communism was stable as nature. I remember on the night when Bulgarian communist leader Todor Živkov resigned, and it was the day after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the restaurant of the university, there was a dinner, and among us was the guy, the man who 9 months later became the first democratic president of the country, the only well-known Bulgarian dissident of this period, Zhelev. And he was telling us, "You're young, you're going to see the end of communism." This was November 10, 1989. 10 months later, he was a president. So from this point of view, the periods in which time really jumps. Many things that looks unthinkable, after 6 weeks, you have the feeling that it was inevitable. And in Eastern Europe, if we're experts on something, we're experts on fragility. From this point of view, it's very different. This is on the level of experience that you know how quickly things can change. So this is why on the eastern part of Europe, you're going to have a different reaction based on different of experiences and not simply of values and interests which normally are discussed.
So you would rather prefer the Habsburg title than yourself?
Habsburg for me was interesting exactly because of the perhaps. Listen, there is a certain type of, probably also because of Burke, because it's, the book starts with, in my view, the best description of the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire that we have. And like always, it was not written by a political scientist. Mm-hmm. It was written by a fiction writer, by Joseph Roth. And this is the story of his famous book, Radetzky March. So in the Radetzky March, there is somewhere in the remote garnison on the borders of the Habsburg Empire, a telegram arrives. And the telegrams basically, there is only one sentence: the heir of the throne have been assassinated. And then he tells the story what happens among the officer corps, the most loyal to the emperor. Suddenly, Hungarians started speaking Hungarian, talking to their own. And then the Slovene officer started to be nervous. And he said, "Stop speaking Hungarian, we should all speak German." And then the Hungarians said, "Okay, I'm going to say it on German. I'm happy that the bastard is gone." So from this point of view, in a certain way, this is when, in the time of crisis, people start speaking their national language, when this type of a project are getting into crisis. And I do believe that basically in every crisis, always the appeal is, let's speak German, let's speak English. Don't go on the national languages. But I do believe that the national languages matters, and this is why, by the way, I was very moved by this translation, because if you're Bulgarian, you believe that if you're lucky enough, you can be translated in English, in German, and even possibly in French. The idea that you're going to be translated in Danish never comes to your mind. And you cannot imagine the pleasure of this. This is like Danish author being translated into Bulgarian.
I won't ask you sort of afterwards to read it out in Danish. But it has been translated into, you told me, 9 languages, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reviews, have they differed? Obviously been different, but I mean from East and West, could you see sort of a different reaction in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia from Western Europe?
The strongest, the most reviewed and the biggest debate the book produced in Germany. And in fact, Germany was the place where the book sold most copies.
Because of the link to the
I do believe
ongoing
that,
discussion, Alternative
yeah,
for Deutschland,
yeah.
and so forth. Yeah.
But also I do believe that suddenly one important thing has happened, and probably this is also the reason I'm here. There was a period of time in which in the West there was a feeling that we know what is happening in Eastern Europe. You like it or not. And then suddenly, many people had the feeling that exactly they don't know what is going on. Some people didn't like it, other people, but for the first time there is a genuine interest. Because after 1989 there was a lot of sympathy, and even there was a lot of kind of a respect for what East Europeans are doing, but there was no question, there was no puzzlement. What they're doing, people are happy, they get free. There is no mystery in this.
In 89, you mean?
1989, yeah. There was no mystery in
because
this.
you were becoming like us.
Yes,
that was what
exactly.
the revolution
And
was
then
about.
also, this was also part of the East European discourse, because if there was one utopia of 1989, this was the utopia of normality. We all the time was saying that we want to be a normal people living in a normal country, which in 1989 means living like in the West, or even better in the West. So from this point of view, I do believe that suddenly, for somebody who is not visiting regularly Central and Eastern Europe, who does not have son or daughter married there and so on, basically what is happening there starts to look strange. Why Central and East Europeans who are doing fine? Because if you go even on some of the economic explanation about the crisis, Eastern Europe does not fit. Listen, Poland is the best performer in Europe for the last 15 years economically. The country didn't have a recession at all. All this explanation that you can say what is going on because of the economic crisis does not work for Poland. And then people are going to say, yes, but it's about social inequality. But in the last 7 or 8 years, the social inequality in Poland has been reduced, not increased. So then suddenly you have the feeling that you don't understand something. And I do believe for Germans, this became particularly important because they have East within the country. And this is the other story. It's not simply the division between, in many countries, this is the division within the country. When it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, I had the Polish. The Russian translation was very kind of recent. The problem with the Russians is that more than anybody else, they believe that they know what is going to happen. And their logic is, if we collapsed, why the European Union should not do it too? So from this point of view, in their case, it's also
Me
very
too
much,
at the geopolitical level, yeah.
Me too. In their case, you have such a strong trauma that they are reading everything which is happening in the European Union very much through this experience, to the extent that from time to time that they're even ready to help this to happen. But in many other countries, this is the first time when crisis is creating community of faith. Suddenly, and this is good about crisis, by the way, suddenly financial crisis comes and many Germans became experts on Greek economic policy. You really start to be interested what they're doing, how they're doing this. And then came the refugee crisis and Central Europeans start to be interested in the German refugee policies. So suddenly we started to be interested in each other. And I do believe this is important. In Eastern Europe, there is a feeling that some of our argument was not heard. To be honest, part of it is true, but the reason it was not heard is also on our side. Because the problem with Eastern Europe is the following. During the refugee crisis, Central and East European societies were the most critical and, to be honest, quite hostile to getting and receiving any refugees. And this was not going to be a huge problem if there was any refugees in the region. But there were not. So this is, physically there were people going through the region, but there were not people in the region. To the extent, just to give you one Hungarian opinion poll, there are more people in Hungary who claim on the opinion poll that they have seen non-identified flying objects than they have seen refugees. I'm saying this not ironically, because then I'm going to tell you that there is something deeper and serious about this reaction. But because of this situation in which you do not have refugees, but then basically you're so hostile, and then you have countries like Germany or Austria, which are receiving a lot of people, basically East European arguments have been dismissed very easily. People cannot understand what is going on, and the explanation become kind of a very cultural explanations. They're like this, communist legacy, and so on and so on. And part of my idea in this book was trying to explain. Explain does not mean justifying. There are many things which is happening in our countries that personally I don't like. There are many governments in our country for whom I will not vote. But it means that we should try to understand what is happening on the level of society. Because to try to explain everything by demonizing one or another political figure or government, is my view, is not understanding.
But then going back sort of to the to what you just referred to, I mean, basically sort of the end of the First World War and the First World War as such. I brought the Sleepwalkers, how Europe went to war in 1914, also because Christopher Clark was here, I think, 2 years ago, going through the book. But your point seems to be that exactly because Central and Eastern Europe had a different sort of experience with regards to the First World War, that actually has an impact now upon the refugee crisis, that they fear that, well, this was a time of multiculturalism and so forth, and now this is getting back to us. Is that one of your points about fragility, about experts' fragility?
By the way, I was recently in Turkey, and one of their ministers said a sentence which should be a good introduction to what I'm going to say. He said, "You should know the World War II is over, but World War I has not finished yet." And I'm saying this because in a certain way, we have been always focusing on the end of the World War II, but in 1918, and this is 100 years ago, something very important happened. The three continental European empires started to disintegrate: the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Romanovs, Russian Empire. But this was three totally different logic of disintegration, which developed very differently in the last 100 years. The Habsburg disintegrated, and basically the Central European nation states came as a result of it. The Ottoman Empire went through protectorates and so on, and now we see the crisis of the post-colonial state in places like Syria. And in the Russian Empire, basically the Soviet Union managed to reconsolidate territorially the Russian Empire. Why I'm saying this? Keep in mind 5 things when you're trying to understand the reaction of Central European society to the migration crisis. First, unlike most of the West European society, Central and European societies has a much higher level of ethnic homogeneity. They have been purged by Stalin and Hitler, and as a result of it, this society, which came as a very much multi-ethnic in the post-World War I period, after World War II ended as very ethnically homogeneous. This period, in the interwar period, for many people was perceived as time of trouble. Just to give one example, in 1939, 1/3, almost 40% of the population of Poland have been non-Poles. There were Germans, there were Ukrainians, there were Jews. After the war, 95% have been Poles. It was not the Poles that purged anybody. This is quite clear, particularly keeping in mind the latest Polish legislation. I want to be on the safe side. But the truth is that as a result of it, you have a major change. And during the communist period, one of the major attempts for legitimacy of the communist governments was making ethnic homogeneity as a source of legitimacy. The second thing that happened is none of the Central European countries has any colonial history. We have not been there. We don't have encounters with people coming outside of Europe. In a certain way, also, there is no sense of guilt. Generally, basically, we believe that we are the biggest victim of history. So from this point of view, we're not going to allow anybody to compete with this. And certainly, most of the national identities of our countries has been the result of opposing some type of a universalist project. Be the Habsburgs, be the communists, be the Catholic Church. It was in opposition. But if there is one thing that people too, which didn't understand, was the demographic dimension of it. Let's give you some figures in order to understand what I'm talking about. In the last 25 years, out of 8 million Bulgarians, almost 1.5 million left the country living somewhere in the West. We're talking about an aging society, which according to the projection, in the next 40 years is going to lose 27% of its population. When the migration crisis started, with the image of all these people coming to the borders of Europe and the idea that all these people are going to come and to stay, what happened in Central Europe was demographic panic. Suddenly, you discovered the mortality of your own national community. You start to fear that probably in 100 years nobody's going to speak Bulgarian. You start to fear that you don't understand the world anymore. You're reacting in the way...
I was reading, yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And I do believe this is very important, because the most under-discussed issue when it comes to the reaction of Central Europe to the migration crisis is the trauma of emigration. A lot of people left. And to be honest, it's not even related only to the economic performance. For example, the Baltic countries, which had very decent economic performance, in the last 10 years, almost 10% of the population left. We're talking about the very small nations. Why I'm saying this? Because, and this is now some political science data, the number of the people, the percent of the people that left certain regions is better explanation for who is going to vote for alternative to Germany than the number of the people who arrived in certain regions. This was the most depopulated regions that voted more for the alternative for Germany than the regions in which more refugees came.
So Sachsen, for instance, Sachsen-Anhalt. Yeah.
And this is extremely important because this emigration element was not part of the discussion. It is also new for Central and Eastern Europe. Listen, 10 years ago, for us, opening of the borders was the best thing that has happened. And if you go on the opinion polls in Bulgaria, if you're asking people what is the best thing that happened after the change, people are going to say opening of the borders. And then suddenly the best is becoming the most threatening. This same border that you wanted to open appeared to be the thing that you fear. And I was telling this story because I was referring to a very well-known book called Death with Interruptions by Saramago, the Portuguese fiction writer. And he's describing very well this situation. In his book, Death with Interruption, this is the story of society in which people suddenly stop dying. In January, nobody died. In February, nobody died. In March, nobody died. This was a triumph. People started to celebrate. It was real happiness. And then, first were the insurance companies. They said, if nobody is dying, we're dying. And then was the church. If nobody is dying, nobody is resurrecting.
That's a problem. Yeah.
And then basically, you start to see how this, which was the best, start to be turned kind of the most threatening in the worst, to the extent that at the end of the book, the prime minister goes to the king and said, Your Majesty, if we not start dying, we're doomed. I'm saying this because something like this happened. And this is why, in order to understand the reaction, you are never going to understand it simply on the fact how many people came. You are not going to understand this basically in economic terms. And you are never going to understand it in economic terms because Central and Eastern Europe needs foreign labor at the moment. The biggest problem of Central European economies at the moment is a very thin labor market. And by the way, in places like Poland, according to the latest data, there are almost 1 million labor migrants from Ukraine, and nobody is talking about this. And the last is, of course, the Muslim factor, which works very differently in different countries, because some of these countries has been part of the Ottoman Empire. Some of these countries, like Bulgaria, has a Turkish minorities. Some of the others basically have no experience at all. I'm saying all this because this was a difficult story, which we never managed to put. And the last point is much more actual politics. It has nothing to do with history. It has to do with the fact that Central Europeans said, you ask quota principle, you ask to the Germans, you're asking for solidarity, for a policy you never consulted with us. If you did not consult us on migration, on what else you're not going to consult us? And don't forget, there are countries in which basically the relations with Germany have been difficult. And all these factors, which has their history, which has current politics, ended up in a situation in which Germans and Central Europeans particularly, but it is also other West European societies, ended up more divided by the migration crisis than the North and the South have been after the financial crisis.
So demography is here one of the core sort of explanations. Yeah. And our two countries, I read, basically in 2050 will be approximately the same size, as you indicate, sort of because of demography. And having been sort of to Eastern Germany last year several times, I can confirm the fact that, I mean, exactly the link between sort of demography,
Yeah.
people leaving, also this sort of, as you call it, the forgotten losers,
Yeah.
the feeling that, well, die da oben, well, they've forgotten all about our problems, whether it's the lack of the internet, or the local doctor has moved and my kids have moved and there's no company here, and now you're talking about refugees. What about my problems? Why don't you start integrating me before you integrate the refugees? That was sort of very much the spirit.
This was very much what I heard in East Germany, because that was before the elections. And what was very much interesting, and you can hear, listen, places which are depopulated, even if you're successful there, your success is devalued. Because the question why people want to leave changes very much the situation. And you know this, there was a beautiful joke in Bulgaria which explains very much also some of the other side of the problem. And the joke is about 3 persons being dressed like the Japanese samurais, and they're walking on the streets of the city. And somebody stops them and said, "Who are you?" They said, "We are the 7 samurais, and we're here basically to make this place a better place." He said, "But why you only 3? He said, "The other 4 work abroad." I'm saying this because also in this small society from time to time you lack a critical mass of people. And the critical mass of people is very important, because this is the problem of the young generation, and this is something that I do believe we're going also to realize talking about this demographic stuff. We're living in a period in most of these countries, but this is also true for Western Europe because of the aging of society, which is just the mirror image of 1968. And this is why I do believe to a certain extent what we see now is a kind of a cultural shift, which is very similar at the same time in a totally different direction to 68. 68, the youth was a big cohort. There were many of them. The baby boomer generation, there were simply many of them. They mattered very much in political terms, in economic terms, they have been shaping it. Listen, in many of the countries of our part, also because of the immigration, also because of the fact that even some people who has not left, but they consider living. If you're a politician, to be honest, you should not be interested in the youth. It does not make sense electorally. These people are either living or not voting or not very much interested in politics. And this is a small generation. As a cohort, it is a small generation. And as a result of it also, to a certain extent, what you are seeing is a society in which the fears, the anxieties of the older generations are very much reflected and represented. And you should try to imagine how much has changed for this older generation. Because when we're talking about my story, listen, I was 24, 25 years old in 65. For you, the future is open. You didn't have time to make many bad things before. You also basically are seeing everything through the times of the opportunity open to you. Then put yourself on somebody who has spent most of his life during the old regime, that basically have been told what is good, what is bad, who also has achieved certain level, be as an engineer, as a teacher, and so on. And also, because this regime was very much based on a certain type of economic predictability and stability, who knew how life is going to look like. And everything has changed. And this type of incapacity to deal with change, in my view, is becoming critically important. People became very tired of change. I observed something very interesting. Everybody of you who know something about Bulgarian history know that after the liberation from the Turkish Empire, Turkey was not the biggest friend in the way Bulgarian society see it, and then suddenly after 1989, in the last 10 years, huge success of the Turkish soap operas. But this was totally unexpected. Why? So I started very much to be interested, but I mean very popular, among older but even younger generation. And then I discovered something which is interesting. People have been very much kind of nostalgic for a more conservative society in which the father is the head of the family, and the family, they eat together all the time. In Turkish films, they're eating half of the time. This is there, and when the daughter decided to get married, she's going to ask permission. So all this was there, but you don't know how to be nostalgic for the old days without to be nostalgic for communism. Because the old days, in a way, was the communist period. So then came the Turkish soap operas, and they were giving this opportunity. This is kind of a traditional society in which you understand. Karl Jaspers has a definition of fatherland, which I found very important to understand what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe. He said, fatherland is a place which you understand and where you have a feeling that you understood. And then for many people in the region, their own countries are a place that they don't understand anymore, and they don't have the feeling that they understood. And in Eastern Germany, of course, this was just in your face.
Very much so. And I guess that's one of the reasons why today, when the Kroko-Vertrag, so the treaty of the Grand Coalition was agreed upon, there is now a Heimatministerium sort of in Germany, so going back to fatherland, going back to we're discussing again German history, but also the very fact that many people are worried that they can't recognize their own country and so forth. So that clearly confirms your point. But going then back to the policy implications of what you just said. Okay, so we have basically no refugees in Central and Eastern Europe. We have still a very big refugee problem in Europe. What do we do then? I mean, what are the policy implications? Apparently it's not sort of the old quota system that we've been debating for a very long time. So what then? I presume common border control. I mean, that should be popular, but then also regional development policy, because, I mean, how do you deal with forgotten losers? Probably not just with Obergrenze für family reunification.
Listen, it's interesting. There was now a lot of study being done on the rise of populist parties and others. One of the most important findings across the borders is that the cultural factor is more important than the economic factor. There is an economic factor.
So
for sure.
Timothy Garton-Ash's article a couple of months ago, it's kulturstupid.
Yeah, it's kulturstupid. And this is basically, there was a Harvard study being done all over based on the Michigan value surveys. Why this is important? Because cultural insecurity is much more difficult to deal than with economic insecurity, because cultural insecurity basically comes from very different sources. One is demography. The other, by the way, is technology. Let's tell you, because in the book I'm claiming something that many people basically believed was slightly too much, that there are many things that probably slightly too much. But my major argument was that the refugee crisis was Europe's 9/11.
Yeah.
What I meant is the following.
Yeah, what did you mean by that?
Listen, 9/11 in the US, 3,000 people being killed in New York is a tragedy. But this is not the biggest tragedy that has happened in the world for the last 20 years on the level of people being killed and destroyed. Why it was so important? Because as a result of it, the majority of the Americans saw the world with different eyes. Globalization, which was perceived as something that is positive, beneficial, working very much in the American interest, then suddenly America discovered its vulnerability, and the backlash against globalization that you see now with the election of President Trump basically started then. In numbers, in terms of numbers, the refugee wave of 2015 is nothing exceptional. The people who entered Europe is less than 1% of the population of the European Union. Compared with the number of the people that you have in Turkey, I'm even not talking about Jordan and others, it's much smaller number. But the effect was the same. It pushed Europeans to discover and to see the world with different eyes. And what Europeans discovered is the following. They discovered simply that in the 21st century, migration is the new form of revolution. Because if you are living in a poor and badly governed country, and you want to change your life, and you're living in the world in which you have internet, and you know how the Danes live, what kind of beautiful library they have, and so on, it makes much more sense to change the country than to try to change the government. Your chances for radical change is much higher. And probably you have noticed that one of the interesting things that happened, and for this, you don't need Communist Manifesto, you don't need party, you don't need others. In a certain way, you need your courage, you should be ready to take risk, you need a Google map, and you go. And also, even when you come here, it does not mean that you're totally cutting with your society and community, because you can Skype, you can fly. This is a very new situation. And by the way, in 21st century, if you see, if in 20th century all revolutions has ideological names, Communist revolution, Fascist revolution, Nationalistic revolution, in 21st century all of them has a company names. Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution. This was kind of a Google map revolution. When you realize that the most radical change in their life that people can achieve is by changing the government, the country, not the government, then European Union discovered itself as a counter-revolutionary power. And secondly, what we discovered is that if before Europe was an idea, institutions, we discovered that European Union is a place. And by the way, place to be protected. Before the refugee crisis, the major question was how to transform our neighbors. After the refugee crisis, the question is how not to allow our neighbors to transform us. And I do believe as a result of it, this is 9/11, for me, is a radical change that comes in the way society see the world. Nevertheless, that the political event that produced this does not need to have kind of a historical consequences by comparing with some others. So this is why, for me, and this is why I do believe migration crisis is going to have a deeper impact on the national politics of European Union, both East and West, compared both to the Eurozone crisis, even Brexit, Russian annexation of Crimea. So out of these four, I do believe that the migration crisis is going to have the deepest impact. It's going to change most European national politics. And you can see this in Italy in the last days, basically, if you see basically the shift in the way the political parties move.
But was that then, the refugee crisis, for you the core sort of game changer when you look upon European integration? Because you're very critical of all the people who dealt with European integration, trying to come forward with theories. And as you basically rightly point out, I mean, it was about the train, right, leaving the station, and then it would just go on.
Yeah.
There was not sort of disintegration was not part of the thinking. A new functionalist theory was about spillover and so forth, never spill back as such. Was that then the game changer? Is that also why, for instance, Mark Leonard, when he wrote this book, and you know him personally, obviously, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, that did not happen? Or were there other sort of aspects that the theorists sort of overlooked than the refugee crisis?
No, listen, in a certain way, I do believe that Mark's book is a very important one because it captured how European Union was seeing itself
as a transformative power,
Not simply transformative. We are seeing ourselves as the laboratory of the world to come. We knew that we are very different than others. We didn't have the illusion that all the world looks like the European Union, but we knew that we are the model of the future because we have been post-national, post-sovereign, much more integrated. We didn't believe in military power, we believed in economic power, we believed in soft power and also in the quality of life. And European Union had all reasons to believe that this is the case. You have the feeling that the world is going in your direction. And just imagine, in a period of 10 years after 2008, how much this was challenged. First, we believed that military power doesn't matter in Europe. We knew that there is a military power. We have an idea, not only authoritarian states. The United States was using military power, but we said, in Europe, it doesn't matter. And then comes Crimea.
Soft power,
And the moment it comes, your major assumption that interdependence, economic interdependence is enough to secure European Union is not true anymore. And you have much more talk about defense, about military spending, then European Union discovered the need of a power. Secondly, we never talked about borders for good reasons. By the way, my major argument is the book is European Union is not so much now in this position because of its failure. You're there because of your successes. Nothing can hurt you as your success. And I'm saying because it was successful. European Union was so attractive that in a certain way it was always bordering its future members. Even Turkey used to be a future member. So from this point of view, basically the problem of borders is not important for you. And the philosophy of the European Union was, okay, what happened? After World War I, when the European empire started to disintegrate, the idea was, let's change the borders in order to create more legitimate states. It was done, but it created the World War II. Then the idea was, we're not so much trying to play with the borders, but let's exchange population. Let's go with the ethnic purging in order to create more homogeneous state, and this is going to create legitimacy. And it didn't end up well too. And then after the end of the Cold War, the idea was, do you know what? We're not going to expel people. We're not going to change borders. We're going to make borders unimportant. Because this was the experience of the European integration. It worked. And it worked. The problem is that it did not work on every border. And then suddenly we're discovering the problem of borders. For example, in a country like Bulgaria, this is a major issue. In a country like Greece, it's a major issue. And this is part of, by the way, the major challenge for me in the European foreign policy. In order European Union to be trusted by the publics in such a different countries, in every single conflict, you should adopt the perspective of the most vulnerable country. So when you talk Russia, you should think like a Pole and a Balt. When you talk about Libya, you should think like Italian. And from this point, but it's very difficult. And I do believe this is one of the things which has changed. People were not ready to do it. And for Eastern Europe, what happened? Listen, in Eastern Europe still, we trust European Union. In Eastern Europe, Central Europe, you do not have Euroscepticism. You have Euro-pessimists, people who believe that it's going to end up badly. You have criticism. But none of this country believes that they're going to prosper outside of the European Union. But part of the trust which normally people had, particularly in European institutions, particularly in Brussels, was trust based on mistrust. And the logic is the following. We don't know what they're doing in Brussels. They cannot be worse than our own. And this is true. This is why European institutions were more trusted than the national governments. And then came the migration crisis and the logic changed. And the logic is probably in Brussels they're better, but they care less for us. And this was a major change which can be seen on the opinion polls. Suddenly, basically, people started to trust their governments, which they not always like, more than basically they start to trust European institutions. And this has a consequences. So from this point of view, when I said, for me after Europe was, we should try to realize that a radical change has happened. European Union should be reinvented, should be rearranged. It's not the same. It does not mean that after European Union there are going to be no European Union. And to be honest also, I don't believe that we can return to the nation states. My personal, I hope I'm wrong, but I do believe that if something wrong going with the European Union, many of the member states are going to face territorial disintegration on their own. And from this point of view, Spain was a signal. You can see UK how difficult, and this is UK how it goes. Belgium is going to have a problem of its own. So from this point of view, the people who simply believes that if European Union is not going to be around and you're going to be back from where you started, I find this more utopian than most of the utopias that we discuss.
But going back to Central and Eastern Europe and the policy implications of your analysis, I mean, what is then the answer there? I mean, with regards to the refugee crisis and Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, what should, for instance, now the new German government do?
I never believed that quotas was an important thing to happen. First of all, we're talking about the very small numbers, and this was partly part of the scandal with Central Europe. We have been quarreling about 1,000 people. This is 1,000 people. And this was done, and to be honest, I'm putting myself, now being in Austria, seeing this through the eyes of the Austrians, which got a lot of people. Per capita, they get almost as much as Germans. And the Austrians are looking to the Hungarians and the Poles and telling, listen, is this the same people who expected us to meet them in 1956, in 1968, in 1981? And now when we're meeting all these people, so from this point of view, you're going to see a situation in which no policy solution is going to happen if these two types of misunderstandings are not going to talk seriously and frankly to each other. Because what we're seeing is, on one side, basically, in Central and Eastern Europe, many governments which are trying to base their legitimacy, saying that sovereignty these days means resisting European Union. This is what it is. And European Union, basically, there are people in the West saying Central Europeans, okay, basically they're culturally different, they're not share our values. This cannot go like this. It can end up with some kind of a two-tier union and so on, but this is not what Europe is going to benefit from. In Central and Eastern Europe also, for the first time, and this is becoming a major issue, the idea of the West as a normal society is challenged by certain corners. You have a much more traditionalist positions. And there is the other difference. To a great extent, 1968 arrived in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989. So you have one generation difference. And you're going to understand this very much if you can compare conservatives in the Western Europe and conservatives in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, a classical conservative leader is a full package conservative. He's conservative on any type of minority you can imagine. Religious, ethnic, sexual. In Germany, in Netherlands, you're going to see the leaders of a conservative party who are openly gay or doing this and that. So they're selectively conservative. And this is very much the impact of the social and cultural impact of '68, because in Central and Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, 1968 has two totally different meanings.
Sure.
In '68, it was about solidarity with those who are not like us. Very strong anti-colonial movement, if you go basically to this anti-authoritarian left, and very much about individual rights, and very much about minorities. We all are minorities. In Central and Eastern Europe, '68, in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, it was about the national sovereignty. It was about resisting Soviet Union. It was about our national history. When the Polish students in March '68 went on the streets, and among them was some whom now we are going to call the classical cosmopolitan Poland, like Adam Michnik and others, they were there after Mickiewicz play, which was talking about the Poland and the power of Poland against Russia. I'm saying this because this totally different sovereignty of the individual, which was 1968 in the West, and sovereignty of the nation, which was 1968 in Central and Eastern Europe, now they clashed. And this clash is not going to be easily reconciled in policy terms. And I do believe from this point of view, the tensions between East and West are going to be much more difficult, as I told you, than between South and North.
Yeah. And apparently there's no silver bullet there.
No, there's no
particularly
silver
also
bullet.
because we have sort of other debates with Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, now let's also move to Hungary or Poland, the political development. I mean, you're right. In your book, you basically highlight that parts of Central and Eastern Europe have turned into a poster child of democratic illiberalism. How did that development then take on speed?
Of course, first of all, it's very different from country to country. There is a beautiful Swiss joke which I should share, because otherwise my methodology is going to be misinterpreted. And the joke is about 3 8, 9-year-old boys, one French, one German, one Swiss, that started to discuss where the babies come from. And the German boy said, they come from the sky, and the parents find them in front of the door. And the French boy became very kind of nervous and started ridiculing and said, for sure they come from the bedroom where mom and dad are, and everybody knows this. But here the Swiss boy became very nervous. And he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. I'm saying this because basically, seen from the West, political processes in places like Poland and Hungary and some other countries are very similar. Political regimes are very similar. In many respects, they're very different. And Mr. Orban is very different than Mr. Kaczynski. It's not who is good or who is bad, but they're coming from a very different tradition. They're basically having a different idea of the state in mind. Why I'm saying this? Because at the same time, there's three things that I find as a common and to which I do believe is important. First, try to think about these governments. If you imagine what has happened in our part of the world for the last 25 years, it looks like a migration. East migrated to the West. Some did it individually, but most of us with our own countries. Which means that we adopted legislation. We didn't discuss it because this is how the club functions. People basically went through very radical changes, and these governments, in many respects, have a problem which is well known in sociology of migration, which is the problem of the second and the third generation. The first generation of migrants come, and the very process of integration is perceived as success. For people like Havel, he wanted to be more European than Europeans. And then comes the second generation, and the second generation starts to discover tradition, starts to feel treated as a second-class citizen. You have to have a level of resentment, and so on. You have this. Secondly, when it comes to the rule of law, what happened was the following. To a great extent, politically, what is happening in many of these democracies is that for a period of 25 years, and this was part of also the reason of success, I told you that this is the price of success that we are paying now, people had the feeling that they can change governments as much as they want. In Bulgaria, only once government was re-elected for 25 years. But they cannot change policies. And as a result of it, what happened is that many people, many of the political scientists in the late 1990s were very much saying to what extent membership in the European Union is consolidating democracy. And on one level it's true, but on the other, if you know that you're a member of the European Union, and if you're really fed up with the fact that you always vote for the different party and you always get the same policy, then you start to vote more and more inventively, let's put it like this, more and more creatively, more and more dangerously, because you're not very much afraid. Because you said, at the end of the day, I can vote for this person who is saying these crazy things, but we're a member of the European Union. If something bad is going to happen, they're going to take care. So as a result of it, we have a process of radicalization of the vote, which was paradoxically also the result of the fact that we're a member of the European Union. And when this started to happen, and also this was because the process in Central and Eastern Europe with some of the political changes was not provoked by the migration crisis. Migration crisis became a catalyst for many things, but it started much earlier. The other problem was that for many people who wanted to change, the very idea of the rule of law started to have a slightly different meaning, because many of these political leaders, Mr. Kaczynski has a theory of political impossibilism, was telling them, listen, all these people are telling you that because of separation of powers they cannot change anything. Give me the power. Give me the whole power and I'm going to give you a change that you're voting for. And this is a very different understanding of political, it's much more majoritarian understanding of democracy, but this is a very strong message, because if you want change and somebody is telling you that division, separation of power has become the alibi for the elites, not to change anything.
But so what change did they want?
Listen, different people, and this is wants different change. Many people wanted change in their lives. Basically, they have different expectations. They wanted economic change, they wanted more money. Many people wanted cultural change. Basically, they were very much disturbed by the culture. Yeah, basically, there was, listen, for example, issues like gay marriage and so on is very divisive in places like Central and Eastern Europe. But the most important was that the message was, give the power to the executive if you want change, because the separation of power is blocking any possibility of change. The only problem with this idea is that when you give so much power to somebody, you cannot be sure that he's going to return it to you. But otherwise, I'm trying to explain why societies which basically start to look for change can go and do things. And this kind of a shift to majoritarian understanding is also part of this cultural shift and backlash I'm talking about. Because if 68 was very much about individual rights and the rights of minorities, what we see, and I don't believe only in Central and Eastern Europe, is much more focus on the rights of majorities. Majorities also has rights. It's very much the centrality of the idea of way of life. So it's not that before there was no identity politics and we have identity politics now. The problem is that before the identity politics was only kind of allowed to minorities, and now it became the realm of majorities. And this is quite important and very well seen also in the United States. We are not simply talking about majorities, but majorities which very often for demographic and other reasons fear that they're going to be minority in not so distant future. The white in the United States, and you can see the consolidation of the white vote behind President Trump, is part of it. So in the book, I'm very much arguing that the group which is shaping very much this type of a conservative turn in European politics is something that I'll label the threatened majorities. Majority groups that started basically to have the fears and the sensibilities of minorities. Just to give you one example as a figure to imagine what we're talking about, there was a study being done 3 years ago in the United States, in the United Kingdom. Do you believe that you can influence the politics of the government? And then the minority groups had a twice higher positive answer to these questions than the majority group. And everybody is saying rightly that this is not true. Still, the Englishman can probably influence the British government more than some of the minority groups. But while the minority groups sees increase of their power, majority groups sees decrease of their power. And this type of a power dynamics, in my view, are very much shaping politics in different places. But in Central and Eastern Europe, of course, it is taking also much more institutional turn. And you can see now in the debates between, for example, the Polish government and the Hungarian government and the European Commission and others, this is going to be a very difficult question. They're not going, when people said, let's find the solution. Solution is not a technical solution. Because just give you one figure from Poland. Majority of the polls, according to the opinion poll, I'm talking when it happened probably, it could have changed since then, opposed the decision of the government when it comes to the changes in the Constitutional Court, Constitutional Tribunal. Simply, 55% were against. At the same time, 55% have been also against Brussels to tell Poland what to do about the Constitutional Tribunal. And this is what is, this is the tension. And this is why I do believe that in most of the cases, what's going to happen in Europe is going to be solved very much on the national level.
But if one follows that line of thought with regards to sort of the EU more or less than being the safety net below the new sort of, let's just call them strong man in Central and Eastern Europe, whether it's now Orban or whether it's Kaczynski, doesn't really matter. Then what should the EU do then? Remove the safety net? I mean, that's part of the discussion, at least. Article 7, suspending the membership rights is sort of part of the debate now. Or if one reads the new German government, what they now suggest is then also have a linkage between the EU budget and countries that do not live up to the various democratic rules. Or would that be the completely wrong approach by the European Union?
To be honest, I don't like very much the idea that you try to basically weaponize transfer of money, and I'm going to tell you why. One of the major things that you're going to start to hear from Central Europe, and probably many of you are going to be shocked, is the following. Everybody is telling how much money went from the West to the East. But what about the money that East Europeans invested in educating the younger generation who now came to work, for example, to Germany or Denmark? And people even now started to calculate how it is. I don't believe that European crisis in a certain way can be solved as calculation on both sides. There is something wrong when everybody just feels as if European Union is taking out of you. Central and Eastern Europe benefiting a lot. We have been changed our countries, not for everybody and so on, and I do believe it was a positive change. And secondly, what I'll say is none of our countries is going to do better outside of the European Union. I can try to imagine the sunny perspective that Bulgaria is going to come off. Imagine that we are leaving European Union and what we're going to enjoy. Turkey, Russia, everything nearby. So from this point of view, this is, and many people know it very well, but there should be much more political calculation how to be equal. The idea that they're not grateful is wrong. And by the way, West Germans now are paying the price of the thinking in terms of being grateful and not grateful. Because West Germany put a lot of money in East Germany, no doubt about this. What they decided to do and the money and so on. But at the same time, when you go to East Germany, they're going to tell you that 70% of all professors in the University of Leipzig are coming from the West. So from this point of view, the idea of political equality and how it's going to work and basically trying to have much more sensitivity for the problems of the other side, in my view, matters. My personal understanding is that paradoxically, what is happening in European Union is that we have 4 crises, each of which could have destabilized dramatically the Union, but overplay of this crisis stabilized the European Union for the last year. They have this famous dance in the 19th century Vienna, which is called quadrille, where you all the time change the partner. And I do believe something like this happened in European Union. Look how the crises helped each other. For example, during the financial crisis, It was very important from the German point of view not to change the rules, because they were right that if you start signaling changing the rules, basically you don't know how the euro is going to survive. But for the Greeks and the Italians, they're absolutely right, saying, listen, according to these rules, we cannot grow, simply. And then came the refugee crisis. And because of the refugee crisis, the decision was taken that the money that is spent on the refugees are taken out of the 3% budget deficit. And then suddenly you get a flexibility that you didn't have before. Because how much you're spending on refugees is a political issue. It could be creative accounting. I'm saying this because suddenly you have a much more room for maneuvering without changing the rules. Or when people are saying Visegrad Group is going to be totally consolidated and act against Brussels and others, yes, on some issues like migration, but go to the Russia crisis. When it comes to Russia, the views of Hungary and Poland are very different. Hungary, much more friendly relations to Moscow. Poland, not so friendly. So from this point of view, strangely enough, all the crises are dividing European Union in very different groups. And it was this division that created political space, which allowed the European Union basically to survive. And also what I do believe is important is that, again, to a certain extent, the United States and the United Kingdom helped very much to Europe to be consolidated. Because as a result of the elections of President Trump, something important happened, not only on general level, but many of the populist parties that the previous year have been moving to the center. They were having the feeling that their time is coming, so they were trying to get much more in the mainstream. But then President Trump basically won running out of the center. So some of these parties, for example, when Marine Le Pen said that she wants to leave the euro, I have been reading the opinion poll. Listen, there is no single data that suggested that this is a popular idea. But she said that if she's not going to do something which is symbolically very radical, people are not going to follow her. But people didn't follow her because people were not there. And from this point of view, this radicalization of the populist parties led to the situation in which there was a moment and the initiative was taken, and here I do believe President Macron did something which was important for Europe, and this is that he was the first one that created a pro-European populism. When people are saying that Macron is an anti-populist candidate, it's not true, to be honest, but he for the first time managed to create the idea of change. Before, if you want change, you should be against the European Union. He basically married the idea of change and the idea of European Union, and this has a very important political consequences. You're taking the initiative. What is funny is that people normally also, I do believe Macron showed something very important also, that when we talk all this talk about Europe, everything is about institutions, everything is about structural things. But listen, there is a personal talent and there is luck, because he was lucky like hell. And from this point of view, luck matters in politics. Personal initiative matters. This is not a chess game. And from this point of view, to try to reduce everything to policies, and by the way, policies is not only what people do. Policies is also how they justify their action. One and the same act is a different policy based on your explanation and justification why you're doing this.
And in your book, you also quote the captive mind, where you write, man tends to regard the order he lives in as natural. And then you quote Marine Le Pen, the European Union is dead, but it doesn't know it yet. Reading your book, you kind of have sort of the very much 2017 sort of mood. That was a time where, if you'd been here a year ago, before the book was written, we would have discussed the domino effect of first you would have Wilders in Netherlands, after we had Brexit, Trump, and then you had Wilders, and you would have the election in France, and then you would have the election in Germany, and suddenly, well, the disintegration train would definitely have left the station, as you also write in your book. Now you seem sort of to be arguing in a slightly more optimistic way. What did you miss there? Was that the Donald Trump effect, as far as I could hear, that you were saying that he at least had an effect upon some of the parties? Or would you say that you didn't miss anything when you finalized it?
Probably everything, but first of all, when it comes to optimism, the demands from the Bulgarians and the expectations should not be high. There was a study being done quoted by The Economist about how optimism relates to your economic situation and so on, and it appeared that there were three groups: the optimists, the pessimists, and the Bulgarians. Bulgarians were very much more pessimistic than their GDP is going.
So you don't have anybody in Bulgaria called happiness like me.
I'm much more hopeful pessimist. So where I stand for? First of all, I don't, to be honest, even then I never believed that Le Pen is going to win or Wilders. But at the same time, I believe that there is a major transformation of European politics which started, and I don't believe that the Macron is the end of the populist wave. I simply don't buy this. And it's not simply because of the Austrian elections. I do believe Italian elections are going to demonstrate it. And certainly also I don't believe that very understanding of how people understand what is the populist wave. We managed to basically reduce the fear of populism to the rise of a certain parties. But if you see the agenda of some of these parties, you can see that we have the emergence of a new consensus on many issues, migration being one of them. So Austria in 2017 elected a Green president and basically didn't allow the candidate of the Freedom Party to win the elections. A year later, basically you have a center far-right government, and in a certain way on many issues the difference between the two is not very big. Why I'm saying this? Because unlike many people who read this very much as the return to the 1930s, on this I'm not as pessimistic for many reasons, but three of them are important for me. First, economic situation is very different than 1930s. Only people who never read history can compare the way people live now with the way they have been living after the Great Depression. Secondly, 1930s Europe was populated by ex-soldiers. All these people has been fighting. All these people knew how to shoot, and all these people had a very high tolerance for violence because of so-called, in history it's known as the Brutality Hypothesis. And thirdly, in 1930s, both the far left and the far right have been revolutionary forces. They have an idea of the future. If you see the communists and the fascists, they didn't like the people in the way they were. They had the idea how to remake them. It was a pedagogical project, but it was very much future-oriented. Look now, the level of violence is very low compared to many things. And secondly, if you see to the populist parties, they don't have a pedagogical ambition. Just the opposite. Their major message is, I like you in the way you are. I don't want you to change. You're very stupid, I like you like this. No, I'm saying this because in a certain way, this is populism very much framed for the consumer age. And many of the populist parties treat their voters saying, listen, I'm your waiter. Just order me, and I'm going to bring you what you want. I'm not going to tell you this is bad for your health or this. Just tell me what you want and you're going to have it.
Don't smoke.
So why I'm saying all this? Because I do believe for me the parallel which I'm going to use is much more with the 1970s. And here is the big challenge to Europe. In the 1970s, European democracy was in a real crisis. I was not being neither very much around, particularly not very much around in Western Europe. But if you're going to read the 1973 report, The Crisis of Democracy, after Electoral Commission, you're going to see what people were talking about. The idea was that the institutions are totally eroded, that a new adversary class is appearing, that the students and the young people don't share anymore the values of the previous generation. And then, 20 years later, the anti-system radicals of the 1970s ended up as ministers in German, French, and other governments, and basically Joschka Fischer. So in a certain way, the biggest success of Western democracies in the period of 70s and 80s was de-radicalization of certain generation, but at the same time, many of the issues that these people cared about entered the political realm. Women's rights, individual rights. So there was a major cultural change, environmental issues. One of the reasons now the Green parties are not doing well because everybody went green. So from this point of view, what I do believe, and this is going to be, is now you have this wave coming from the right. And this is very much about the rights of majority. It's about belonging. It's about other things.
Much,
yeah. And the problem is, can the liberal democratic institutions, particularly when the European Union is much more integrated now than it was then, be able to socialize and de-radicalize some of these people in the way it did with the wave of the 68? Because probably some of the things that they're saying make sense. Obviously, borders is an issue. You cannot simply say we are for open borders, but you can also not close the borders simply because there is no in the world closed border. The only closed border is on the graveyard between this world and the other one. So from this point of view, obviously there are going to be something which would look as a political compromise, but how it looked, and are our institutions ready to do it, and what kind of institutions we're talking about? Because technology also is changing a lot. I was talking about the demographic fear, and demographic fears are very typical for Central Europe, but I do believe that the next crisis is going to come from the Western Europe. It's going to be about technological fears. The United Kingdom survey claims, the United Kingdom government, that in the next 30 years, 43% of all the existing jobs in the European Union are going to be automatized. Is it true or not? I don't know, but I'm giving you in order to get the scale. And what is interesting, most of this is going to be white-collar jobs. One, for example, of the groups, because I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she's trying to decide what she wants to study, and she was interested in law, and I'm just telling her, according to this study, the lawyers are not going to be in high demand. Because there are going to be a lot of legal software. But in a certain way, how this is doing, and I do believe that this type of a crisis in which it's so difficult to imagine the world, or technologies, for example, normally 10 years ago, personally I believe that technology is a natural ally for democratic societies. And to be honest, I'm not sure anymore. For example, if you see China, not Russia, Russia is not sophisticated on this, but China is highly sophisticated. One of the biggest problems of the authoritarian regimes is that you don't have an access to relevant information, because you should rely on the police information, and police institutions has the tendency to distort everything that we know from literature. Now with the big data is not exactly like this. The level of surveillance capacity of the new technologies, the level of social control. So we're obviously facing a society about which we don't know much. And here is talking about my fears for the EU. I have one major fear of the EU. European Union started with a political project which was very much based on experimenting. This was the most courageous and brave experiment after the war, in which most of European societies basically were killing each other till yesterday. You're starting to create a political frame in which they're going to live together. If you're going to see with the eyes of the people that have been going out of the war, this was extremely courageous. Now I don't see a lot of appetite for risk-taking on the side of the European politicians. The word experiment, for example, in 1990s was a dirty word in Bulgaria. They said, who wants to experiment? To go to a doctor. So from this point of view, I do believe that what is changing is this: in order to be successful in this type of a period, you need a much more experimental understanding of what is going on, while what I'm seeing basically is very strong tendency, particularly on the level of the European institutions. Things work well, it's enough to continue doing what we're doing. We have now economic growth, and economic growth is going to be enough in order to re-legitimize the European Union. Here I'm pessimistic. I don't believe economic growth is going to be enough. First, because we don't know for how long. Secondly, if the cultural anxiety is at the center, economic growth, particularly growth of 1%, 2%, 3%, is not the one that can deal with this. Where I'm optimistic, I do believe that every kind of a revolution produces a certain type of a counter-revolution. But the counter-revolution mainly serves to legitimize some of the gains that cannot be reversed anymore. And from this point of view, and I have this in the book, when we talk about Habsburg Empire, now everybody is interested how it collapsed. But many historians claim that if it was not for the war, it could have survived. And the most important is, 100 years before it collapsed, everybody expected it to collapse. So probably for the European Union, more interesting question is to answer is, why it didn't collapse for all these 100 years? So probably this is going to give us a better chance to understand, because my idea is the capacity to survive is the major source of legitimacy of any political project. The more crisis you survive, the more legitimate you are. And from this point of view, if we go through this crisis...
then we are in a better shape, then. That's your point.
It's in a better shape because people start to, basically to take your existence as natural. This is what happened to the nation state. If you see in our countries, in Central and Eastern Europe, how much we basically believe that the nation state is the natural order of things. Have you asked yourself for how long most of East Europeans have been living in the nation states of their own? For a very short period of time. But you have the feeling that this is the natural form of political existence. And this is why, for me, capacity of survival is so important. And Machiavelli has this beautiful quote, I'm telling, not quoting, but he said, for every ruler, even for a good prince, there's good time and bad time. And nobody can simply avoid and escape from the bad times. The problem is, have you managed to accumulate enough of a positive sentiments during the good times in order to survive the bad times? And I do believe European Union has a chance.
Well, that then completely explains your sentence here. It's quite possible that European publics will become more confident about the EU, not because it has become better, but simply because it has survived, as one of your points. Before we end, I just wanted to ask you about Germany, because I was struck by the interview in Der Spiegel, which I have translated from German into English, and you say the following: Germany is now one of us. For a long time, this country was living in a totally different world than major parts of Europe, as if Germans were on holiday and the others were going to work. It was a paradise. The economy was stable, the confidence in the institutions, political parties, and the media was impressive. When you, as Germany, are living in a different world, it is difficult to understand the problems of others. Indeed, the Germans were of the opinion that they had nothing to do with the problems of the others, quote unquote. I was struck by that because it seemed to me as if you, unlike many other people who are worried about that Germany now has Alternative für Deutschland, a populist party, that this could lead to Weimar or whatever, when you also read the German press, you seem to take the different angle that this could actually change the German policy and make Germany, well, maybe more normal, or at least more sort of accept more problems of other countries. You also refer to Dieselgate, and now you also have Affengate with the with the monkeys and VW and so forth. So you actually could that lead to more of your optimism? Strangely enough, maybe, but yeah.
First of all, I'm not so courageous to commend Germany in your presence. But my feeling was there was something particularly about Germany as a leader of the European Union in the last 10 years. The years that have been very difficult for others were the best years for Germany. Look at the financial crisis. It was financial crisis for others. Germany benefited. I'm not, by the way, blaming Germans, as you know, but simply the truth is the Germans benefited from it, and they benefited not simply in financial terms, but as a result of the financial crisis, some of the young, talented Portuguese, Greeks, and others ended up working in Germany. Not simply that they get a good migrants talented, but also from the cultures that they understand better. So as a result of it, because Germany was doing fine, the feeling in many Germans was that it's enough others to do in the way we're doing this and everything is going to be fine. And then suddenly you realize that even holiday is not forever, because the results were a surprise for many. And secondly, basically, when you talk about others being corrupt and trust and so on, and some of the big German industries, some of the scandals, of course, shows that basically corruption is much more spread in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in some countries, but it's not something that Germans don't have an idea about. And then suddenly I do believe that Germany developed much more empathy to the problems of the others. I do believe that Germany is going to be a better leader in its current form, in which they start to doubt some of their own successes, to ask tough questions about themselves, to see problems, than in the previous period in which they have been very much celebrating themselves. And this is very important, because without Germany, Europe is not going to function. From this point of view, Bulgarian experience is very different. We're much more kind of German-friendly than some of the other Central European countries, having different experience and so on. But I'm saying this because also the German-French relations changed. Listen, France suddenly got a different self-confidence. Not that so much change in the French economy, but people start feeling different, and Mr. Macron looks like a leader, and so on. So there was a major disbalance between Germany and France, which was also not very well for the European Union, because France was not standing only for itself, but it was a certain representative of European South in the way it was created. So now first you have a much more balanced leadership. And also I do believe that in a strange way, Germany better understands Eastern Europe when you see how people vote for Alternative for Germany. They better understand some of the problem of the others. And even if you see basically all the compromises that went with the Grand Coalition and others, Germany realized that it cannot succeed being very different than the other parts of Europe. So is it going to be good or bad? This is the problem with optimism. We always can find reasons to be optimistic. The only problem is not to overdo this, because if we're going to overdo it, the idea is that this is natural. It's not natural. It's going to depend on people. It's going to depend on the Chancellor. It's going to depend on the Social Democrats. It's going to depend on others. It's going to depend on Macron. So from this point of view, if there is one thing about the book, is politics is not like algorithm. They're also about people and how they feel and what they're going to do and what they believe in. And from this point of view, yeah, probably I'm more optimistic than a year ago, but I'm not buying for a minute the idea that European crisis is simply over and everything is over, and now with Macron and with Merkel, the only thing that we should do is basically to forget. And also the world has changed a lot. And the change is much more deeper. Even when probably there are going to be different presidents of the United States, United States is not going to be back where it was. And China is not going to be back where it was. And Russia is never going to be back in the 1990s. So from this point of view, everything is changing, and we should enjoy it.
Yeah, and Europe still hasn't dealt with the refugee crisis anyway, so
Yeah,
the game
absolutely.
changer is still there. which
Exactly.
has to-
And
as
yeah,
opposed to
and it can
response.
have a kind of a new peaks at any moment, yeah.
Well, we could go on further, but that's not possible. You mentioned the good and the bad times, and obviously this has been a good time. You are
It was a good time for us. It's not sure that it was a good time
well,
for the audience.
we'll have to ask them. And you are in the country of obviously the country of hygge, right?
Yeah.
Hans Christian Andersen, and now we also won the tennis tournament in Australia with Caroline Wozniacki. So obviously we bought you, not to worry, not a book about that, but a book about hygge, so you can remember this session. And who knows, maybe when we have the next sort of version of After Europe, you will then also elaborate on the concept of hygge.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And
No, thank
back
you
to
very much. And thank you very much to the publishers. Thank you very much.
I couldn't resist.
Yeah. So much.